everyone. Thank you for coming out. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel, New Frontiers, How Emerging Leagues Are Reshaping Sports. My name is Kelly Conlon. I'm a first-year student at MIT Sloan. So today, for our panelists, we have Steve Argeris, who's from Well Law Firm in DC. Love the audience participation. We have Mike McCarley, who is the founder of Tomorrow Sports, the parent company of TGL. We have Katlyn Gao, who is the co-founder and CEO of League One Volleyball. And we have Mike Buckley, a two-time world champion sailor, CEO and co-owner of the US SailGP team. Our panel today will be moderated by Shira Springer, a lecturer from MIT Sloan. The panel will run for 40 minutes, and we will leave 5 minutes at the end for questions. Please submit any questions you may have via our Cadence app. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Shira.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all. I am excited to have this conversation about emerging leagues. When we were preparing for this conversation, we had a lot of interesting topics come up that I'm hoping we're going to cover this morning, including attracting and managing relationships with investors, how do you measure success, growth strategies, and storytelling. But one thing that got all of the panelists really engaged and excited and evoked a lot of emotion, dare I say, was the topic of hearing no, and how many times they have heard no as they were starting out with their leagues. So I thought I would start by asking each of the operators to share a lesson from having heard no multiple times. Please pick just one. And then we'll go to Steve, and we'll talk about, because you're on the sort of flip side of that and coaching investors and leagues to say no. So we'll head in that direction. So I'm going to call Mike Buckley here because to differentiate between the two Mikes. So Buckley, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we've all heard no a million times or more. And I think, you know, for me, I've always been driven by that as an athlete. You know, I was always told you're not good enough, or, you know, you can't do this, can't do that. And I don't like to think about proving other people wrong. I like to think about proving, you know, what I believe in right. But you know, a little successful no story I like to talk about. When I first kind of kicked off on trying to commercialize my sport, I sent a DM on Instagram to Tommy Hilfiger, the person. And I said, hey, you're the first person I'm reaching out to. I think there's not a better brand in the world that represents, you know, kind of America than Tommy Hilfiger. You know, what do you think about doing a call? You know, no answer. You know, a year later, I saw him at the Met Gala on TV, and he was wearing red, white, and blue with his wife, and Lewis Hamilton was decked out in Tommy Hilfiger, and I was like, oh, I'll send him one more note, and I chickened out and I didn't do it. The next day, I ran into Lewis at Soho House, and I was like, this is a sign. I got to send him another one. Again, nothing. And I felt like, you know, I've been rejected now. But 5 years later, Tommy Hilfiger is a global partner of our team. You know, so I think we kind of all go through this, right? Whether it's an investor or a sponsor, or, you know, your fans. The power of no, I think, is pretty exceptional, and, you know, probably drives us all to one degree or another.
For sure. I feel like we could. Can you guys hear me?
No, it doesn't.
Speak a little louder.
Yes.
Hear me? A little low.
How about now?
Yeah.
All right, I'll just hold it. Well, we like to say you don't ask, you don't get. And along that journey, that means a lot of no's when you do ask. So this could definitely be a group therapy session. We started this with very much a spirit of this is a huge market of the most popular girl team sport, and we want to commercialize it our way. And that was really starting with the community up, with youth up, with a lot of discipline. So that took us 5 years to get to our very first pro league that just launched in January on ESPN. So that journey along the way, just that model alone, now looking back, it was like, that was the smartest decision we've ever made. But you can imagine that when we first started trying to paint this picture of going and commercializing the entire sport with an ecosystem, and you don't even start with the one that usually people start with. There's not a single pro league in the US that's ever started with community up and youth first. So that was definitely our journey, and now that the live game are on ESPN and it's a real product, looking back, we're very thankful that we really stood our ground and continue to execute with that vision in mind.
Our story is similar, but probably different. I mean, my background in television, I was at NBC for 20 plus years, working on some of the biggest events on TV, and it was always going to be a star-driven enterprise from the very beginning. And that meant, starting first with a business partner with Tiger Woods, and then Rory McIlroy, and then working with the PGA Tour to bring them on board as a partner. So always kind of operating within kind of a best of the best type ecosystem. And that extended its way into our commercial partners, whether they be investors, team owners, et cetera. And I think the reality of what we were doing, we had a lot of people who believed in it, but then there were people that you would pitch, and if they didn't get it, you just kind of end the conversation as quickly as you can, and you want to try to get to a fast no as opposed to a long, drawn-out maybe, which is kind of the worst in these scenarios. So we had a real thesis around star-driven, global pieces of the business that I think resonated with people. But if they didn't understand the core product and the technology, they weren't going to get to a yes. Mm-hmm. So we moved forward as fast as we could after we would kind of sense that.
I just say you had an interesting stat when we were talking backstage. What percentage of your conversations ended in no's?
Just looking back on it, and it was in the middle of the pandemic when no one wanted to meet in person, which was a huge blessing when you look back on it when you're trying to raise money. I would say 90% of the people said yes.
Wow.
Into what we were doing. So, and part of that was years of relationship building inside the business and just making sure you always treated people the right way. And when you call them for an idea or a little support, it generally worked out for us.
Now, Steve, you're in the position of saying no or helping others say no when it comes to advising leagues and investors.
I've represented the people being told no to in terms of startup leagues like Major League Cricket and Major League Pickleball, and also investors, and just trying to Mike's point, we talked, like, that is the best thing I think you can do as an investor, is say no quickly if you're not going to be convinced of something, and politely and ideally you say here's how, or here's how I would get to a yes, or here's why I'm saying no. So at least there's some learnings from that interaction. But I can tell you how crushing it is to have to tell somebody who's like, oh, your client is like the perfect person for this. It fits with their thesis. They'd be great for our cap table. And if there's a multitude of reasons why somebody would say no to something that might have nothing to do with the idea itself. They might be preoccupied with something else. They might have a relationship issue. They might have a different part of their business. These sorts of things, some of which you can share, some of which you can't. But again, getting clarity soon is the quick answer. On the founder side, when we represent the leagues and properties, it's really like the vision of the founder, preserving that as long as possible. There's a real benefit to that for the clarity of vision, keeping everyone rowing in the same direction. And then when you have somebody that's extraordinarily compelling, coming with a ton of capital, and they've got great ideas, it's very hard for the founder to say no. And I'm sure I'd be curious to hear when you guys have said no to someone about something to change your vision, and there's no right or, it's all a guess, right?
Yeah. I think you have one road, one vision, but if you can't articulate that vision in kind of that singular way in which you're going to get there, any road will kind of, I think it was the Cheshire Cat said that, any road will take you there if you don't know where you're going. So you have to know where you're going and be able to articulate that clearly and get everyone on board with that vision.
And I think some of it, especially for emerging leagues, they're proving out so much. So you want people on your cap table who are along for the journey and want to pivot with you and isn't just honestly checking homework, right? So we do want to have that intention up front, and it's definitely a luxury to be able to say no, but it is really in keeping with what you know to be the vision, and can they actually come along for the journey?
That's not to say you don't get great ideas of, okay, we can take a little a change here and a change there, especially when you have really good business partners who want to recommend things. And usually if it doesn't take you off of kind of where the core business is going, it's generally something you want to engage in.
And Mike, you said something about, if they don't buy into the concept, you just sort of move on. If they're just not getting the concept, you just move on. So it brings me to the question of basically, you're selling something pre-product, right? There's a lot of hype, there's a lot of excitement, you hope, in some corners, but you're pre-product. What challenges does that present for you as an operator? I'll turn to you, Mike Buckley.
Yeah, I mean, we bought the team in November of 23, so the league was established for 3.5 years before we got in, so it wasn't quite pre-product, but it's still, in a sense, pre-product. If you're walking in a lot of rooms and say, we own a professional sailing team, a lot of people would start questioning what that meant. So education is a huge part of what we have to do right now, and I'm sure it's the same with both of you. You spend the first few minutes educating whoever you're speaking to, whether that's a potential investor or a potential sponsor or broadcaster or whatever it is. And then again, some of them either see the vision right away, and usually that leads to something really positive, and others just kind of maybe don't get it. But we're still in that early growth phase of having to educate and market to the consumer, to the sponsor and potential investor.
Caitlin, I was going to say the same thing with pro volleyball. I mean, there were pro volleyball leagues prior to Love, but you had a very different concept, as you mentioned. Community Up, it was also more about an ecosystem than a pro league in specific.
Yeah, absolutely. The concept of commercializing a whole sport from youth to pro then became the thesis that would all lived under growing the brand. So League One Volleyball, abbreviating to Love, that was very intentional for us to start with the youth and then grow into pro. I mean, for 5 years, we were pre-product on the pro side. But meanwhile, we were building this community at the grassroots level. We're now in 27 states. We're in 71 locations, and 19,000 athletes from the age of 8 to 18 are going to tournaments 7 months of the year wearing a Love patch. So as soon as the pro league launched, that connection became so much more real. But prior to that, it was us painting the picture, but also the founding athletes from the Olympic team that went to Tokyo and won gold. They were along for this journey and helped us build what pro is today. So for them, it was real because they all knew what it was like to be immersed in the youth club world, and they really wanted this to happen. So they really created this with us.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, for us, the pre-product for a long time and not having anything close to what we were doing, except for painting a vision and using some artist renderings. But the reality is what we set out to do is you can kind of explain to someone, if you're inventing a sport in 2025, it would be live in prime time, it would feature global superstars in a globally recognized sport, there'd be tons of data, you would create as much video content as you possibly could and distribute that as many ways as creating those moments so it'll move on social. And
So it's easy.
Very easy, very simple. But how do you do that for a sport like golf with 600 years of history and tradition? And that's where you start to kind of lose people for us from a pre-product standpoint. You say, okay, we're going to take a 200-acre golf course and we're going to use technology to condense it down into the size of a football stadium. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wait, what? You're going to do what? Mm-hmm. So the technology was a way to accomplish live and prime time, lots of data, all of those sorts of things. It wasn't necessarily just using the technology for technology's sake. It's like, no, we're trying to create a version of a traditional sport that is, from a consumer standpoint, is an improvement or something different that in theory should get younger, broader audience to engage with that sport. And so far, so good. But we were pre-product until we were live on ESPN and 129 other countries and territories around the world. That was the product.
Mm-hmm. So now I want to talk a little bit about attracting investors and the different types of investors that you bring in or are able to bring in. And one of the things that strikes me about SailGP and you, Mike Buckley, is that you were the first to bring in private equity. And I'm curious what kind of a difference private equity made for you and your team.
Yeah, I mean, so Ryan McKillen, who was the third employee at Uber, and I bought the team in November, and when we kind of set out to raise money, we wanted great partners. We didn't want any sailors on our cap table. That was a big thing, and I know that sounds crazy when you're own a sailing team, but we wanted people that weren't going to be in a box all thinking alike if we were going to create something first of a kind. And we wanted great people, great partners doing epic things in their space, whatever the heck that meant. And all of a sudden that ended up with Issa Rae, who was in the Barbie movie, Griffin, who's a famous DJ, who's like kind of reinvented the way DJs do live performances with instruments and things like that. Gary Vaynerchuk, DeAndre Hopkins, the NFL player, and Avenue Capital, Mark Lazzary's private equity. And, so November 2023, we bought a sailing team with the most diverse ownership group in the history of our sport, which is something, we're super proud of. Most of those people, when you see them, when you see images of them, people say, what do any of these people know about sailing? They know nothing about sailing, and that was by design. Having private equity come in has sort of validated the investment for others. And now all of a sudden, valuations have soared on new teams being purchased. Other private equity have come in. Other major NBA team owners and A-list celebrities are buying teams that are about to be announced here in the next few weeks. And I think we've seen what's going on in the NFL and the NBA around private equity and Formula One. It's it really, I think, really validates things. And then when you have great partners. Everybody's a great partner when times are good, but it's through the tough times that it's really important, right? Through the problems, that's when you realize whether you have great partners or not. And I think probably all of us on the emerging side, there's tough days, right? We're not going to be the NFL or the PGA Tour tomorrow. We hope that we will be someday, but having great partners is huge.
Yeah, speaking of great partners, I know that you had Atwater Capital lead your Series C, Katlyn, and that was a relationship that was a year and an investment that was a year in the making, right? Because again, investing not in the league, but in an ecosystem, and from what I understand from you, that's very important. So how do you pursue investors and decide that the investor is the right fit for what you want to do with Love?
Yeah, very similar story in terms of that vision alignment is really, really important because this isn't just writing a check, you're along for the ride. And we've really benefited from having that diversity as well of people bringing in very different perspectives. When you look at our earlier rounds, we've now had 3 rounds, all oversubscribed, which has been fantastic. We've had different profiles of folks, including celebrities who have actually real personal relationship and relevance to the sport. Amy Schumer, Candace Parker, Jason Tatum and KD. So there's a lot of that. But yes, also we have institutional investors from growth equity, from venture capital, especially in the beginning, where they understand what it means to grow a brand. And growing a brand that has both experiential products like training and consuming pro, to physical products like merchandising, and all the way to digital and content. And for the pro-specific product to emerge, it can't just be a competition product, it has to be a cultural product. I mean, this is very much what they call the attention economy. So to really bring a product forth where people choose to consume you versus something else, it has to emerge in the cultural zeitgeist and relevance. And so with Atwater and all of their connections and their experience in the entertainment space especially, that's really what attracted us to them. And they really liked what they saw from the time that they got to know us to when they actually came in and led the 3rd round, that consistency and discipline of us executing on all the milestones we said we would.
And Mike, you have the benefit of Rory and Tiger by your side.
Yeah, we had a lot of angels that came in early, family offices mostly, and a few who were interested in the parent company and the overall thesis of kind of embracing technology to create modern versions of sports. And then they learned the business that way, and then because of that, they ended up buying a team. So Alexis Ohanian, Arthur Blank, Fenway Sports Group, et cetera, kind of came in at the parent company level, worked with us for a while on a lot of development, and then understood it and were able to move pretty quickly when it was time to start bringing on team operators, which was a good model for us. We had a few others that were, Michael Rubin and Greg Maffei when he was at Liberty came in personally, because we wanted to get the input and the feedback from them as a business partner in their areas of expertise, and that worked for us very, very well.
Mm-hmm. Steve, I want to turn to you and either get the investor perspective on how do you figure out, how do you counsel investors? What's the right fit? What should they be looking for? Do you have a sense? Do you have metrics that you use?
They do. They're very sophisticated. What's interesting, though, is that the private equity investment in sports has taken a different tenor, I think, in the emerging company leagues, where it's more like a classic venture capital, where they're providing advice to you. In the NBA, NFL, NHL, like they're contractually restricted from rights that are sort of normally the bread and butter of private equity firms coming in. Like they have limited information rights. They are not serving on boards, and they're not serving in operating capacities, things like that. So I think it's interesting as the funds that would typically be what they're looking for are coming into sports assets, having the ability to make an impact. What I'm hearing from the founders on the panel, it's just an interesting dynamic where they're shifting to more of a VC role than they typically take, because they're sort of locked out from that. It's just more pure passive investment in the major leagues.
I think the VC piece of it's important because this is, I mean, what we're talking about, especially at the stage we're in, it is venture. I mean, there's a significant level of risk. Then your post-product, it completely changes, and the dynamic, I think, is more in line with what Steve was describing.
I want to switch and talk a little bit about the business models, the growth strategy. You can, have team owner operators. You can have single entity business models. We have a mix here. I know, Steve, you have some very strong opinions about that. So maybe we start with you and sort of what you've observed with regard to single entity versus other structures, and then talk to all of the operators about how they came to decide what structure they would operate under.
In every league, whether it's emerging or the National Football League, there's tension between the 32 clubs in the NFL and the league office, and there's an understanding of the rules of the road for 100-year-old leagues. There aren't necessarily for startup properties, and you have these investors that are incredibly accomplished in what they've done, and have a lot of great ideas, but there's a central tension of, do I want to sell locally or do I want to sell nationally, especially when you don't have a strong track record, because you can't selling at the national level. The NFL, they've got a pretty strong track record of making league-wide deals, right? For a startup, it's different, right? There's no track record because there couldn't be. So when you have strong people that have you have strong business development records from a founder that's maybe investing in a team, they're naturally going to want more control over the rights that they sell. And so what's the right answer? When is the sum bigger than the whole of the parts? There's no right answer. I think from a founder's perspective, obviously, staying with that conviction as long as possible and maintaining that is probably the right answer. And it also lets you sort of get off the ground faster than having a lot of different opinions. But on the other hand, I'm seeing Michelle and Julie sitting in the front row of the NWSL, and they help drive that business forward very strong at the local level. So there's no right answer. It's just really depending on your investor stack. But what you can't let it do is let that alignment fall apart and really stop you from getting off the ground. That's the number one thing.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn first to Katlyn, because you do have the single entity now. You are running all that Love is, from the youth up through the pro level, which is a lot.
A lot. And we've also benefited, as was mentioned, the speed in which we're able to move on things, how quickly we can pivot, how consistent we can make it. As an example, on the pro side, we actually allocated our 90 athletes instead of doing draft, which is more of the typical model. And that was intentional because for us, the most important anchor for the pro league is that we're aiming for the NBA level of play here, because we have the best talent. We've medaled at the national team 20 years in a row at the Olympics. So there's no reason that there shouldn't be the NBA volleyball to play in here. And so those are the athletes that we attracted, 10 of the 13 that just won silver. And so in order to do the parity the way that we felt like was true to the game, we had to do this in an allocation style. And it's actually based off of not just the level of talent being equal, but also we did pay attention to where do they go to college? Where do they go, and where was their youth club? And some of them actually came from the youth clubs that we now are under the Love umbrella. So those are all taken into consideration. That's allowed us to really create a level of parity that I think is absolutely unprecedented in the US for volleyball at this level. That said, also what we're noticing is that without the benefit of the local investor, the team owners at the pro league level, we are missing some things as well. Right? Nobody is perfect. That's why it's called emerging. Even the really major leagues are probably working on some things. And for us is, how do we then move this in a really methodical and thoughtful way
into a place where we do get the benefit of that, as well as what we've already established was a very strong league and a very strong brand.
Mike, Buckley, do you want to talk about the structure with SailGP?
Yeah, SailGP is pretty unique. It was founded, about 5 years ago by Larry Ellison and Russell Coutts. Russell's probably the most successful sailor globally of all time. Larry owned all the teams. They started with 6 teams, so he owned the league and the 6 teams with, the idea that that's the quickest way to scale. He didn't want one team to be left behind and, one team with a lot of money and one team with a little. And they were able to operate, based on, one person, right? A dictatorship. And I think that's what's really helped scale. Their goal was at the end of the 4th year to sell half those 6 teams as private franchises. Today, we're at 12 teams in total. And I think by the end of next month, there'll be 10 will be private. So exponentially ahead of where they thought they'd be. But now all of a sudden, we show up and we have a business to run, and the next team has a business to run, and there's really 10 businesses being run, or 11 if you count the league. And so I think it's a pretty unique spot in our kind of ecosystem of how everybody gets along, because everybody wants everyone to be successful. We want the league to be successful, and we also want the least commercially viable team on the grid to be successful. That only helps us. So, I think we're looking at how other leagues are run because we're kind of in that unique spot right now where there's big changes coming. And I'm sure a lot of you have been the leader in your thing, and then all of a sudden new people, come into your class or come into your business and they have ideas too. Some of them are great and some of them, aren't so great, and how you all work together. But I like to say that, all of our problems in our SailGP ecosystem are due to growth, which is a good thing. They feel tough some days, but it's all due to the fact that we're growing so fast, and we're in a different place today than we were a year ago, and certainly than we were 5 years ago.
Who are you looking to for models or as models? What inspires you? What are you saying? Let's see if we can try this.
Yeah, I like to think that SailGP is sort of Formula One, and maybe the PGA Tour had a baby, and it's a similar demographic to PGA Tour, but we're a racing property like Formula One, similar hospitality, high speed, that sort of thing. So we definitely, we're obviously very interested in what TGL's doing, what LIV's doing, what PGA's doing. We're very interested in what Formula One and NASCAR with their new charter agreement going on. I think those are all properties that we look to get advice from and see what's working and see what isn't. So time will tell what's right, and I'm sure you, Mike, you go through this sort of thing, right? As you sell.
Yeah, for us, it was really about trying to gain alignment amongst all of our business partners, and we, including the players. So we went out and tried to create something that was going to be complementary to the existing ecosystem, and that had a lot to do with the schedule. That had a lot to do with sponsors, and frankly, for me, there was a lot of relationships that were pre-existing. That you're bringing a lot of people that you've known and worked with for 20 years together, and how can you put a structure together? And I think Steve has seen it from some of his other transactions. We worked with Proskauer, we looked at the NBA model, then we looked at the MLS model, which is, the MLS model is really just kind of all of the things that the NBA would probably prefer to improve over the years, and they did it. And we combined it where you've got a parent company, you've got an existing governing body, you've got team owners, and we've got players who all have a piece of the pie. And how do we make sure that we keep everybody rowing the boat in the same direction? It's not easy, and it's a fairly complicated structure, but it's the right structure with all of the different groups that we need to make sure that they get alignment and maintain alignment as we continue to grow.
Mm-hmm. We wouldn't be at the analytics conference if we didn't turn the conversation, or so we have to, it feels in some ways, turn the conversation here at the analytics conference to data and measuring success. And I am curious, what is the one, maybe one or two metrics, what are the one or two metrics that you look at and say, yes, this is an indicator that we are doing the right thing, have the right structure in place, have the right investors, have the right vision, that it's all coming together the way we had hoped when we drew it up. I know there's some interesting TV numbers with SailGP that you can mention. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the one metric, but that's the metric that strikes me.
Yeah, I mean, for us, data is a huge part of SailGP. On the competitive side, our boats spit out 5 billion data points a day, which is, a ridiculous amount of data. So we're always trying to use data to improve our performance. One of the unique aspects of SailGP is all the teams share data. So in Formula One, each team has, probably data that's equivalent to that, but they don't get the data of the other teams. For us, we get in and we know, or even in real time, what the best team is doing, and we can compare ourselves, and right away what you're doing right or what you're doing wrong. One of the things that was the most exciting for us on the investment was the TV numbers. I'm sure most people in this room would never guess that SailGP on CBS last season had an average viewership of 700,000 viewers, which, to put that comparatively, NHL is kind of 400,000 to 500,000. Formula One was 1.1 million. So all of a sudden we're like competing with some of the biggest properties in the world. We had 3 races that had between 1.6 and almost 2 million viewers on a Sunday afternoon when you could be watching the NFL. So that's kind of back to the education, as emerging leagues and sports and teams, educating the consumer that, again, if you were a betting person, you would never bet that SailGP on a Sunday during NFL was going to get almost 2 million viewers. But that's where we are, and that's, I think, what we all strive for, eyeballs. And you got to prove yourself on linear before you go to streaming or direct to consumer, so that you can walk into your next sponsor meeting and show them the Nielsen numbers, or maybe they've already seen it before you walk in and they take you seriously.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, I think when we were talking about who do we look for as reference for us in learning, I think as a new league, it's both a blessing and a curse that we get to actually create a lot of things that with unencumbered sort of freedom in some ways. One example I'll give is internally, we actually look at LTV. So what is the lifetime, and we're tracking this, and definitely not perfect, but what we really care about is the lifetime consumption of the sport. And it's all under the Love umbrella, and of course beyond that as well, but that's one aspect that I'm not sure a lot of leagues have tracked. And we have data now from youth all the way up to pro that we can actually connect the dots. The second piece is actually what's the data that fans actually care about? Because if you've only watched the Olympic level volleyball every 4 years, you might actually forget what you should care about. For us, it's, should we actually be teaching certain stats that, unlike the NFL, MLB, NBA, everybody knows what to look for, but is it the kills? Is it actually how high that these women can actually jump? I mean, as you know that many of our women can actually jump as high as NBA players because from the age 8, they've learned how to do high verticals. That's the game. You jump really, really high to spike that ball. So these are all things that we're thinking about in terms of both B2B, what are the operational metrics we should be looking at uniquely because we have ecosystem, but also what are we teaching the fans to care about?
I like that. What are we teaching the fans to care
Yeah,
about? Yeah,
that's a good point. Look, the greatest measure of the health and vitality of any media business, or especially sports now, that's really driving a lot of the media, is going to be its media metrics, whether it's television ratings or social media views. And I think we created a product that was, instead of 4 days sunrise to sunset, it's 2 hours, 2 teams enter, 1 team leaves a winner 2 hours later. And we did that intentionally that it could fill in the same window as a basketball game, both a college basketball game or an NBA game, because we're being played at the same time of year. And we wanted to be able to play in that space from a media partnership standpoint. Can we kind of fill in and be the same or similar audience level of college or NBA? So far, so good. One thing that we have found is in the first few weeks, you're seeing your peak audiences over 1 million, and then we're also starting to see the difference in week 1, week 2 social media video views, where we'd see, okay, week 1 there was 1 or 2 videos that did over 1 million viewers, And then you see, okay, now there's 4 or 5 that are doing 4 or 5 million, video views. And then this past week, we've had one that did over 7 million so far this week. So I think the reality is over time, people are catching on and they're making their decision on how they want to engage with the content themselves. If they don't have time to watch in prime time that night on television, they'll catch up the next day on their phone, and that's fine. We can monetize those viewers and those consumers however we want. We just want to design a product that will get them in both places, wherever they choose to watch.
Yeah, also from what you've told me, it seems like you're designing a product that is penetrating the culture in a very specific way. You're breaking through in unexpected ways, and I think it may not be a quantitative data point, but there's something important about the culture of TGL.
Yeah, we've had athletes. I mean, I think this past week we had Eli Manning and Derek Jeter and Big Papi, and a lot of baseball players who've been there for spring training. Josh Allen had his bachelor party, which we knew was going to happen. He'd bring his bachelor party to watch a couple of matches. But then that same night that Josh is having his bachelor party, Celine Dion's team calls us the day before and says she wants to come and bring her family. So you're kind of in this weird world of people from all walks of life who are there. Ninja, the video gamer streamer, was there that same night. We've had country music artists, rappers. I mean, it's been pretty intense. And then my favorite story is last week. I was with the CEO of a sponsor that we're talking to, and he said, I was asking my daughter about this. She's a freshman in college, and she says that she and her boyfriend have a group of friends. They all get together on Monday nights and they watch. And I said, oh, what do they do? He's like, you're gonna love this. They have a drinking game. And I told him, I said, you have to send me the rules of the drinking game, which I haven't dove into too much. But there are those little anecdotal kind of, we are breaking through in cultural zeitgeist type moments. It doesn't have to be Celine Dion singing live on ESPN. It can be, a Florida State sorority and fraternity having a drinking game.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, from your vantage point, I'm just curious, what metrics do you look at? I mean, TV is obvious one, but are there others?
Number one, it's ability to pay your legal bills. But no, in all seriousness, I think a broader thing about expenses and expense management is hypercritical. So you're not constantly having to do a sort of emergency funding round or going back to rounds. And because if you need money because your burn rate has exceeded what your plan was, the budget, then you're probably going to be getting less favorable terms than if you're doing a more orderly new round. And I've had clients that have had to go to their investors and say, look, we really just need this to get through. And obviously that erodes that sort of confidence in the budgeting process and whatnot. Just keeping expenses, because again, going back to saying no to an athlete that needs something or saying no to something that's about a safety issue. You can't say no to a player safety issue, right? You have to manage that appropriately. And so doing those things is really, really challenging, I think. But budgeting appropriately as best you can, because it's all a mystery, is the number one thing to me.
And I think an important part of that is making sure you prioritize based on that vision, prioritize where's the money going to go.
Yeah.
So for us, media product, player experience. Mm-hmm. That's 1, 2. Everything else is distant, but behind that.
I want to turn to some audience questions. We'll start with Steve. It says, for Steve, from an investment perspective, what are the different ways you can see leagues maintaining strong, forecastable recruiting revenue outside of long, lucrative media deals?
I think recurring revenue is going to come from sponsorship outside of media rights, right? I think licensing for merchandise is great, but it's probably not as big as what Mike's wearing. Mike's modeling several, hopefully long-term recurring sponsorship deals, I'm guessing. And
Tommy Hilfiger collaboration drops in August.
Yes, there you go. So you get the best of both worlds. But the problem with sponsorship is it's an enormously long sales cycle. Ideally, if somebody says yes on the first and gets the vision and wants to do it, but it can take 12 to 18 months, which is extremely challenging to forecast, but it's a really tough job.
Mm-hmm. And now we have, let's see, this is an interesting one. What do you focus on with emerging leagues as far as the athlete experience is concerned? How do you think about the athlete experience with emerging leagues? I think this might be best suited for Katlyn. So why don't you take a stab at that, because it's something you really have to think about, given the high quality, but also the very emerging newness of your program.
And for us, we have both youth and pro.
Yes.
We have 19,000 youth athletes, and we think a lot about the idea of whole athlete training, which from the very beginning, if we're going to drive better life outcomes through the commercialization of this naturally women-led game, how can we bring a sense of training that's really consistent, we can invest into it for the youth. And so our whole athlete training that's delivered through our 5,000 youth coaches has everything from what happens on the court, off the court, mind, body, craft, and also life. So we're introducing modules that have to do with digital citizenship and financial literacy. I mean, think about these 18 and under, mainly girls, and getting the benefit of that through their coaches as opposed to parents, because I know my kids aren't really listening to me anymore. And it's much more effective when the coaches are actually introducing these concepts. For the pro athletes, we had the benefit of really getting them into the Founding Athletes Council, who have been meeting for 4 years prior to them actually playing our first season. So a lot of the input, and it turns out, yes, it's salary, of course, but at the end of the day, there are little things that they care about that if you just listen to what that is, it's not always going to be cash related. There is just consideration and intention behind it. And also because they've been along for the journey, we're able to make some of those trade-offs with them side by side with us, as opposed to here's a list of asks and here's what we can do or cannot do. And I think that dialogue is really healthy.
Going to turn now to Mike Buckley. In SailGP, has the decision for teams to share data improved the quality of the league's league's product? And if yes, how?
Well, I think, what you don't want is the same team winning all the time, right? I think that's like the worst thing for sports. I'm a lifelong New England Patriots fan, and it's good to be back in Boston this week, but, it's probably wasn't the greatest thing for the NFL to have, the Patriots winning every year. And I think the same thing in our sport. Our sport's been, SailGP's been dominated by the Australian team for the first 3 years. And, so using data to get all the teams closer together, one of the hardest things for us is that our boats are always in transit around the world. So we don't have access to the F-50s that we race on. So the only way that you can improve is by looking at the data and, game footage basically of what the other teams are doing. That all sounds great, but the best teams are looking at the data too. So it's not like the gap's just like closing like that. But yeah, I think it's really important. Last season, one of the younger teams in the league won the season championship, the Spanish team. And I think that was really great for our sport. Nothing against the Aussies, but it was good to see somebody else win. But yeah, I think Formula One has gone through this too, right? Mercedes winning for all those years, and then Red Bull. Awesome to have McLaren win the constructors last year. It's good to have different fan bases experience the success. I think that just allows everybody to, be more profitable in the end.
Okay, and this will have, I think, this will be the last one of the audience questions, then we'll have one sort of future-looking, forward-looking wrap-up question. But for Mike, with TGL, how has your league gone about making fast changes out of the gate? For example, TGL has modified the rules mid-season, they say, note, in a good way. How did those decisions get brought up and implemented so quickly?
I think it gets to Steve's point about, kind of one singular vision, and I was able to make the decision ultimately. We were able to gain consensus with everyone. We did 200 test matches in the year leading up. We had an analytics company run all sorts of simulations on our rules. We went through the first 2 weeks of competition, and it wasn't as tight as we wanted it to be. So great that Arthur Blank's a team owner. I called Rich McKay. He's been the head of the NFL competition committee for 26 years. And I said, here's the issue. What would you do? And he explains it to me. Same thing with Theo Epstein at Fenway. Called him, and we had a conversation about it. And then we ran a bunch of simulations on 6 or 7 different iterations of the same rule. We got down to about 2 or 3 that kind of made sense. Some of the players we talked to liked one better than the other, but it left an unintended consequence that was going to create a problem for our television partners. And then we just decided, I always told our team, we need to be improving every single week. And if you are not changing, you are choosing that this is okay, that this is good enough. And I have never been in a world where I ever want to say good enough on anything. Mm-hmm. So the idea was we had a triple header coming up on President's Day, which was a big day that we had worked on with ESPN for quite some time to really promote the sport. And so we changed the rule right before that day, and we had 3 matches, all went down to the last hole. 2 of them went down to the last shot. 1 of them went into overtime. So it almost instantly kind of changed the narrative on what we thought was that we didn't see in all of our testing, but we were able to make a change. And it was a very data-driven decision, but ultimately it was just a decision that needed to be made and put it into place and don't look back.
So exactly what you wanted. I want to quickly ask one last question. I just also want to note, Katlyn, there are people in the audience who want a love team in Boston. We'll have to make that happen. But Steve, just looking very quickly, running down the row for you, do you see the interest from investors in emerging leagues, the interest in emerging leagues waning, or is this going to sustain?
I definitely don't see it waning. I mean, whether it's having international sports like cricket and rugby that now there's more of an American audience to, or just new sports like pickleball that, I mean, it's not new, but new in a professional sense. You need a low basis. A low basis is helpful to earn an ROI, so you're going to have an easier time at that end. But no, every new thing that I hear that they're starting a new pro league, I laugh, and then it ends up working. So not anytime soon.
Thanks for the vote of confidence.
And then just for the operators looking for, what's the future? What's the next big thing on your agenda? What's the future hold for you and your league, for TGL?
Well, we're working on focused on our playoff start in 2 weeks and finals, and we'll be finished 2 weeks before the Masters on the golf calendar into March. And then we're working on new products. I mean, both in golf and outside of golf, but still similar thesis, just trying to take globally recognized, very popular sports and create a modern media version of those. And we've got a lot of different conversations going on with different sports that have come to us from all around the world. And some of them are really interesting, and some of them, I think we'll put on the back burner, we'll say that.
Katlyn?
I mean, continuing to commercialize the sport. We have our sights at the pro league level to be the NBA volleyball, and we've been executing that even with our controversial start with just a youth and then moving up. So yeah, no less than world domination, I guess.
World domination. And Mike, Buckley, yes.
Yeah, I think for us, what we've been missing is storytelling. We have what we think is a pretty darn good TV product and racing product, but I think what Formula One and Drive to Survive taught us a few years ago is the connection with the people is really what drives value. Tiger Woods has inspired millions of people around the world. Tom Brady, Kobe Bryant, all those types of people. What's going on in the NBA? What Caitlin Clark did, right? It's an emotional connection to a person. You guys are probably all fans of the people that play the sport of the team that you're a fan of first, and so I think that's what we're missing, right? America fell in love with Daniel Ricciardo's smile and Drive to Survive, and Max Verstappen's killer instinct and what Lewis wants to do to make the world a better place. And I think that's the biggest opportunity for us, because there's a lot of great stories around what we do, and so hopefully we'll be able to kind of add that to the product we already have.
Terrific. We'll look forward to more investment, new products, world domination, and some more storytelling.